Even though years have gone by, I still hear people raving about Robert Kirkman's Invincible and The Walking Dead, but not Outcast. And after reading it, I think I've figured out why. Woof woof! Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Mad Dog, and we're back with another video. Written by Robert Kirkman and illustrated by Paul Azaceta, which is a name that I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing correctly. The first issue of Outcast was published by Image Comics in June of 2014, with the 48th and final issue being released in April of 2021. And something strange is happening in the town of Rome, West Virginia. Carl Barnes has spent his life being a victim to these demonic possessions that have infected those that he cares about most. And now with the help of local Reverend Anderson, he wants to find out why. But when they start digging, will they find more than they bargained for? Okay, before I start, let's just remember that art is subjective. Words spoken before disaster. And at first I did quite like this. It felt different and unique, even though there were a few techniques that reminded me of other artists such as David Ayer and also Sean Phillips. And I liked that because of this style, in the beginning I felt like I just always had to keep aware. The small panels within panels that would show just a minor detail like a fist or a smirk were integral to creating that tone early on that you just couldn't trust anyone. It was a style that made me observant because I could find myself lingering on one minor detail just in case it was a clue for something bigger. And I really did get behind this minimalistic look for a little while, because it made the majority of Rome feel deserted and empty. And when there was a much darker scene, because it wasn't afraid of using just a solid wall of black as a background, it made me focus more on the possessed, and it gave it this creepy feel that it needed. The palette used in this was also great, and it was so pale and desaturated that it contributed to the mood that it was going for. Initially I was surprised that they didn't try and go black and white like they did with The Walking Dead, but I'm really glad that they didn't because it helped it to separate itself from other Kirkman titles. However, I did have some issues with there were some issues that I had with Azaceta's work, and that minimalistic look would often work against the series when it came to the characters. There were about 3 different people in this book that just all looked like Reverend Anderson, and the longer that the book went on and more characters were introduced, it became difficult in some scenes to recognise Kyle if he wasn't the focus of the panel. And this happened to other characters as well, and I'm not sure if this was an intentional technique to give you that feeling that you just really couldn't trust anyone, but all in all, it doesn't seem like a good game plan. Towards the end of the book as well, when there was a lot more supernatural elements at play, there was just a lot of stuff that was there. It became too much of a mess to the point where I wasn't really sure what I was supposed to be looking at, or even what was going on. They just kept talking about the Great Mage and saying Great Mage all the time and that the Mage is happening and just hoping that the art was doing the job. And I've never been shy about admitting this, but I'm a dumb reader. I am not somebody that's coming into this with a super intellectual view, but I really couldn't see what was developing page to page, although maybe I just didn't really care at that point. I'm a bit 50-50 on the design of the entity as well. I liked how in this rigid straight line style it looked abnormal and that it didn't belong in the real world, but I just wish it had evolved over the course of the series or been different depending on who it infected. So there are some good elements to the art here and just others that I wasn't really a fan of. But if you did want to check the series out for yourself, if it looks like a style that you would be into, you can get this from the channel sponsor, Organic Price Books. They've got great packaging, fast shipping, and amazing customer services, and if you use code WOOFWOOF, you'll get $2 off your order. And if you're ordering 3 or more books and you want them to be delivered together, make sure you use code WOOFWOOF, ship it together for 5% off your entire order. Don't worry, you can just copy and paste them from the description down below, and you can use these codes as many times as you like. Okay, when it comes to the story, I wish I could sit here today and tell you that this deserves to be in the same conversation as other great Kirkman titles such as The Walking Dead and Invincible. But if I'm being honest with you, I just can't. The first half of this story was solid. It was eerie and mysterious, and I felt like it knew what it was intending to do. And especially in the first half, I feel like it had that signature Kirkman pace, where it knew when to step it up or to let things simmer, or the perfect time to drop in a twist. But if you've ever been on a roller coaster that's great for the first minute or so, and then all of a sudden it just gets a bit boring, and to make it worse, the staff come to you and tell you that it's going to be about 30 minutes before you can actually get off the ride. That's kind of what Outcast felt like. But I went into this book blind too. I knew that it was horror, and I was pleasantly surprised that it was going down this paranormal route. I remember hearing interviews from around the time when issue 1 was going to be released, and all the talk was surrounding The Walking Dead, and if Outcast was going to be able to live up to that reputation, or if it was just going to keep living in its shadow. But it's good that it didn't really feel like it was trying to follow in The Walking Dead's footsteps. And probably for the best too, because in the end it really would have fallen short. And I do wish that the religious aspect would have been more integral to the overall story, because I thought in the end it was going to be this giant battle between paranormal and religion, but in actual fact, it just became an entirely supernatural story that just occasionally remembered that religion was supposed to be a factor. Carl was an interesting main character, and the backstory with him and his mom and his daughter and Allison just really made me root for him from the beginning. I liked how broken he seemed and how that fueled his desire to work with Anderson. And despite what I'm saying about the series overall, there was never really a moment where I turned off him, and I felt like he was the one that in certain situations he reacted with the same emotion that I would. And the best bit was that he did have this tragic backstory, but it wasn't just there so that you pitied him. Anderson was also a good partner for him. Sure, it felt a bit cliche that they're going to have a local Reverend be one of the main characters, but he was still so well written that it wasn't really a problem. The setup with his family was intriguing as well, and I liked that that got a chance to be fleshed out. So yeah, I blasted through the first two hardcovers and I had a great time reading them. Rome was also an interesting setting, even if I did keep expecting to see the Colosseum and get another ticket for breathing near a tram. Reminded me a bit of Ozark too, with that small town setting where everyone knows everyone but nobody wants anyone knowing the business. It was a creepy place and it really fit the vibe, and I'm just glad that they didn't up and change it every couple of issues. There were other characters that I liked as well, like Megan and Mark, and I was probably rooting for their relationship more so than Kyle and Allison. Megan in particular was guiding a lot of the developments without ever really being in the front seat, and it's just a shame that around the halfway point they didn't get much of a chance to shine. But that halfway point was where the majority of this series began to fall apart. And it's funny because with most long series it's a gradual decline, but with Outcast there is a very specific moment that I can pinpoint and I can go, that is the moment where it never really recovered from. But this book for whatever reason decided to completely change gears, and I hated the majority of what followed. That handful of characters that I liked, they got diluted by about 40 or so whose names I can't even remember. And the longer that the series went on, they just kept adding more and more. Sure, they wanted to show that this crisis was stretching further and that the merge was on a greater scale, but if you put a gun to my head right now and told me to name 10 characters out of Outcast, well, I'd just tell you to pull the trigger, please. What's worse than that is that the majority of characters could just be split into two groups. They were either obviously good or obviously evil, or they were a main character or somebody that was guaranteed to be possessed. So that mystery element of not knowing where the entity's going to go next just disappeared completely. And there wasn't really a lot of complexities to other characters. It was only really Anderson that had any kind of wrinkle in his morality. And the problem with that is that that wrinkle was also the downfall of this series. Invincible and The Walking Dead knew how to throw a spanner in the works effectively without it derailing everything that's going to follow. But there was none of that with Outcast. That one spanner, which yes was exciting at the time, in hindsight felt like it was supposed to be the end of the series, but instead realised that it had another 20 or so issues to go, so it decided instead to just limp its way to the finish line. Because after this point, the aim of the book just wasn't there anymore. Sure, they said what the goal was, but the majority of the good characters were pretty much just waiting for something to happen. And not having the covers between each issue was actually to a detriment of these hardcovers, because I'd read a couple of scenes and then I'd just feel like I needed a bit of a break. Just to go back to the characters as well, I said that Anderson was the only one that really felt like he had his morality tested, and that's highlighted even further because at a certain point it became that the good characters wanted a good thing to happen and the bad characters just wanted a bad thing to happen. As well, this is a minor spoiler, but in the end it turned out that the bad guys were just another generic evil organisation. They explained the motivation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another shady group that wanted to bring about the end of the world, or whatever the Great Merge actually meant in the end, because I just didn't really care at that point. And something about this just really reminded me of the series Postal, and I just can't put my finger on what it is. And at first, when there was just one shady character that felt like they had a lot of power, that was more intimidating than a group of people that pretty much all had the same power. It's kind of like the Terminator paradox, in that the Terminator is scarier in Terminator 1 and 2 when there's just one of them that wants to hunt you, than it is when there's a group of Terminators and you can comfortably take a few of them out. And it did get to a stage where they just replaced one evil character for another one and just change a few minor details, but they were pretty much just the same person. And that's one of the biggest blunders that this series made, that they got rid of one of the most interesting characters way too early and then just replaced them with an angrier version. This felt like a paint by numbers Kirkman book, and in the end it was missing that special something that his other series had. So it copied a lot of the blueprints or the techniques from The Walking Dead or Invincible, except for those amazing fights that have still stuck with me years later, but didn't want to do any of the legwork that made those series stand out and go on for years and have a loyal, increasing following that wouldn't mind waiting months for the next installment. And maybe that was the problem. I checked the release schedule for the single issues and there were ample times that it took multiple months for the next issue to come out. Yes, sometimes it's down to the art. I know Otley took a while between issues of Invincible and it was worth it every single time, but sometimes the writer has so many things happening all at once that they can't really focus on one project. And between the ongoing series that Kirkman was writing writing, the work that he was doing over at Skybound, The Walking Dead having a TV show that I know he was quite heavily involved with, and also Outcast getting a TV show before the first issue was even released, makes me think that maybe the Outcast series wasn't really one of his biggest priorities. So it did really meander in the second half of this, and I spent longer wondering why than I did actually enjoying the third and fourth hardcover. And just to give you a bit of context, I read the entirety of The Walking Dead, all 16 hardcovers, quicker than I did this final volume. What I find most interesting is that there's a letter from Kirkman in the final volume where he talks about the fact that he had the final scene envisioned in his head before the first issue was ever released. And it shows, especially in the last couple of issues. It just does whatever it needs to connect the dots. Rather than it feeling like this evolving story that could have gone anywhere, it often pauses itself so that it can play catch up to get itself to the ending that it wanted from the beginning. And you see this happening sometimes, and the one example that I'm going to use has got nothing to do with comics because it's How I Met Your Mother. They knew the ending that they wanted from season 1, and it might have made sense during that time, but by the time you're actually ending the series, things have evolved and the characters have changed. So that ending might not fit in the way that you wanted it to now, so you do have to be a bit flexible, and you can't always go with the ending that you wanted from the beginning. Hopefully that made sense. In all honesty, this could have been condensed down and been some kind of 36 issue series, or maybe even cut it down to 30, and had that been the case, I reckon I really would have enjoyed this, because there was a lot that I liked in those first 24 issues that I really wish it would have carried on with. It knew how to create intrigue, and it had a great yet small cast, and it was this premise that I wanted to see evolve. And maybe that's why I'm being way harsher with this series than any other that I've reviewed before, because when you combine those elements that I saw at the beginning with one of my favourite writers of all time, of course I'm going to expect something great to happen. But there was a very clear moment where that hope just died for me, and I can't really reference it anymore without jumping into spoilers. This is your final spoiler warning, so if you don't want anything ruined, skip to the final verdict. But that moment that I've been referencing quite a few times is when Anderson killed Sydney. This was a real oh shit moment when it happened, and I was excited to see what the series had planned next. But when I think back on this series so that I can have a more positive outlook, I think I'm going to tell myself that it just ended here. Maybe I'm in the minority with this one and everybody else absolutely loved this. It wouldn't be the first time that that's happened with one of my comic opinions, but this pretty much felt like the equivalent of what they did in The Walking Dead to really introduce the Governor. And by the way, make sure you check out my video which is the most unforgettable moments from that series, which, spoiler alert, isn't something that I'm going to be doing for Outcast. And Sydney's murder became just a shocking moment for the sake of having a shocking moment to end the second hardcover. And like I said, the series just never seemed to recover from this. The tone changed completely, it was less about horror, and I don't think that was a direct outcome of Anderson killing Sydney, but it's the moment where I noticed that everything started to go wrong. The only saving grace of this moment, besides the initial shock value, is how it managed to tie into Anderson's ending. I like that he ended up in prison and he had to pay for his crimes, and he was still in good spirits, and he thought that this was part of God's plan. And all things considered, without them just completely brushing the murder under the rug, this was the nicest ending that he could have. Prison did not seem to be treating him well at first, and it also looks like it might still not be treating him that well by the end, but it's kind of sweet that he managed to find his peace amongst all of this. But that's probably one of the only aspects of the ending that I actually really enjoyed. Everything else just cleaned up way too neatly. I wanted Cal to get his life back and have that peace and that comfort, and yeah, he had Allison back, he also had his daughter back, but then it's like, his mum's just magically recovered as well. I know they gave us some supernatural mumbo jumbo to justify this, but it just felt a bit weak. Like, everything tied up so neatly that I thought that the only way that this could happen is if somebody went back in time. And with the left turn that this took with all the superpowers that were brought into it, I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. They did hint that Cal still got that paranoia, which I liked, and I really hope that they weren't hinting that there was going to be a sequel. But Robert Kirkman bigged this up as he thought of the ending before he ever knew what the beginning was. And your ending is that they have a really nice barbecue and everybody's okay. That inspired you so much that you had to write a 48 issue series. And if he was talking about the mergers being the ending that he saw from the beginning, then I don't really understand this either, because it was so messy that I didn't really understand what was happening. Again, dumb reader, please remember that before you scold me in the comments. But what was going on in here? Allison was killed and then she was brought back to life, which kind of defeats one of the biggest rules of horror. You can't really just keep bringing people back to life all the time, unless it's a slasher killer, because of course we need sequels. But there were absolutely no stakes in this. At a certain point as well, it felt like they were doing that blank page technique just because they didn't really know what they could put there. To give it credit, I did like that scene where Carl was a kid again and he was going against his mom. I thought that was a really poignant moment, and I actually would have been okay if they just completely ditched off all this merging stuff and just had that as the big climax, because it just became a byproduct of the merging. You had this big thing that was taking place all across Rome, but what I actually cared about was this more more personal story that was going on. As well, I think I mentioned it there, but I'm that annoyed at this series that I haven't really scripted this out fully, I've just got notes. But how come all of a sudden Kyle just becomes Cole McGrath out of Infamous? At least I think that's his name. I get that from the beginning they established that he had some way of overcoming the possessed, but it just manifested into this electric looking power. I know that's probably not what it is, but I preferred earlier on where they were connecting it to all of the senses. Now you've kind of completely diminished that and he can just shoot electric out of his hands and everybody's healed. And his dad came back into the picture to train him, but at that point I really didn't care. It really seemed like Kyle had already got a handle over this. I did like the more emotional moments between those two, but it just came a little bit too late. And the development of Maggie and Mark's relationship ended up being a whole lot of nothing as well. When she got possessed, pushed Mark out of a window and paralyzed him, I was like, oh shit, they are really gonna let the entity destroy the only stable relationship in this series. Is Mark gonna be able to forgive it, or is he just gonna see what the entity did? But nope, after a handful of scenes, he was just like, hey, it's fine, these things happen, I've already come to terms with it and we're gonna just go back to normal. Just do me a favour and make a passing glance at the wheelchair every now and then so that the readers still think that this is going to be an important storyline. Like, give me some real tension between these two. The early storyline with Maggie's Stalker X was an interesting storyline that I wish could have carried on a little bit longer and developed a bit more. And what is it, are you afraid of just giving these two something more than just being in a supportive role? Because that's all they really became to me, and I wish they would have had a bit more influence over the entire storyline. This is my final verdict. And sometimes the stage when a book is released in a creator's career is as important as the book itself. Robert Kirkman's one of my favourite writers. He's a name that I trust when it comes to a longer series, especially because he's proven himself on 2 separate occasions. But unfortunately, as much as I wanted Outcast to be included in that sentence, it's not. Don't get me wrong, it very easily could have been, and there were glimpses of hope from the beginning. For the first 24 issues, there was a great but deliberate pace. It built up this creepy town that was perfect for the concept that it was going for, and combined it with engaging characters that I wanted to see succeed. All the makings were there for a phenomenal series, but in the end, it's clear that the tail was wagging the dog. It's sharp at making bad decisions, and it doesn't correct it with anything new or exciting, and just tiptoes its way to an ending that just wasn't really worth steering towards to begin with. I would easily recommend the first 2 hardcovers of this and just tell you to pretend that it ends there and just lump it with other Image titles like Morning Glories and the Manhattan Projects and just pretend that it never really had a proper ending. And with the way that the internet is, I'm sure there's going to be somebody who's going to enjoy telling me that my opinion's wrong, but what's the point in doing a review if I'm not going to give you my honest experience? And unfortunately, all in all, Outcast was a letdown for me. If you've never read a Kirkman or Image title before, then maybe you'll have a different impression, and the art does have its own unique feel to it, but all in all, and with me trying to not be too generous with the scores that I'm giving out, I can't give Outcast anything higher than 40%. Woo! So that's the video, hopefully you enjoyed it. Until next time, just make sure that you stay safe and stay mad, all you dogs. Woof woof! See you at the next video.